I see you found our little hiding spot in the universe. Don't get too comfortable. This is a place where you will find those with an experience that's out of this world, or possibly deep within your life. I welcome you to the Oracles with James Tyson. Lean forward and listen. We will pull you into a supernatural journey with guests from around the world, each one experiencing some of the most extraordinary phenomena this wee planet has to offer. I wish to invite you to support the program through the Oracles with JamesTyson.com Patreon link. For as little as $3 per month, you qualify for a free monthly psychic reading, a past life regression, and exclusive access to our filmed interviews. Don't lower your guard. That's just the beginning as we give back. When I have reached 2,222 members, we will be giving away monthly trips to supernatural hotspots and conferences across North America. Don't run. I can see you. With a limit of 4,500 Patreon supporters, you will want to get your passports ready, as every third month, we will include paranormal conferences and tours in Europe and Australia. I know you can hear me. Visit theoracleswithjamestyson.com and click on the Patreon link. Where are you listening? That's the Patreon button at theoracleswithjamestyson.com. Now, here are the Oracles with James Tyson.
Thank you, Liam, and thank you, listener, for tuning into this episode of the Oracles with James Tyson. Yeah, which is me. I'm pumped tonight because I have a wonderful paranormal lecturer, presenter, and author on, Morgan Knudsen. She is the award-winning founder of Entity Seeker Paranormal Research and Teachings. Now, you can follow her along on our website right now if you want. If you got nothing to do when you're in front of a computer, and hopefully you're not driving, you can go to entityseeker.ca. That's all one word, entityseeker.ca. and find out some of the stuff that she can do. Entity Seeker Paranormal Research and Teachings is actually the evolution of the Association for Psychical Research in Canada, which was founded by Morgan's great-grandfather in 1918. Morgan does classes. She does presentations on this phenomena, and she brings them all to a new level. This is something that I'm very interested in talking to her about, her lectures that include fire art demonstrations and bringing up this absolutely fantastic evidence she and her team has captured over the years, and uplifting stories. What I mean by uplifting stories, and we're going to talk about this, Morgan's found something that I think is really interesting, and I'm going to start following up on this a little bit, actually a lot of bit more, with some of my psychic friends. Some of the things that she has identified in hauntings, maybe you have a negative entity bouncing around the house. She's actually helping audiences recognize that by managing who they are on the inside, it directly impacts what they're experiencing on the outside. And it actually forces them to re-examine where they thought they were in their world, who they thought they knew. We are going to talk about the house that has a negative entity in it compared to the house that has a positive entity. And what she has found in her research is very surprising. And you got to stay tuned for what she's figured out. It's absolutely brilliant. I think you're going to enjoy what we found. Morgan can actually be seen on various television networks internationally, such as Discovery Channel, Travel Channel, Destination America, T&E, and out in the UK, West Red. She is the resident paranormal specialist featured on Haunted Hospitals and Paranormal 911, both kind of connecting to that first responder. You know, the EMTs, the fire, police, ambulance, whoever shows up to a location in the haunted hospitals, it's the nurses and the emergency doctors and things. We got some stories about what they see when this happens. Now, we've talked about this before, the higher vibration people, the empaths, higher energy, whatever you want to call them, that gravitate towards the helping careers, whether it's a maid, a butler, a musician, an artist, an engineer, or a designer, to teachers and medical staff. And people who like to help another human being are usually a bit of a higher vibration, which is kind of interesting when you end up having to bump into something like I have in my past as a policeman, to end up seeing things that I couldn't explain at the time. I probably could. I just didn't want to. Yeah, she's the resident paranormal specialist featured on, again, Haunted Hospitals and Paranormal 911. Did you know Haunted Hospitals is actually currently the highest rated Discovery Network show in the UK? Check your local listings. It's available globally, and if Paranormal 911 isn't, see if you can find it somewhere. She also is a writer and contributor to Haunted Magazine. And you can, any of the Haunted magazines, check those up online. Just Google Haunted Magazine. Or actually go to Morgan's website at entityseeker.ca. You can click on that link to Haunted Magazine. And also her book, Teaching the Living, From Heartbreak to Healing in a Haunted Home, is out now and available in ebook format and paperback. And you can get those by going to the store on her website. Morgan is a very, very interesting woman, very, very bright. We're going to bounce a few ideas off each other, and it'll be one of those beer conversations where we're going to sit down and kind of compare notes, and I'm sure I'm going to learn something from her. Morgan Knudsen can also be heard as one of the co-hosts on a internet radio show, Spaced Out Radio. I'm excited to have a sit down and a beer conversation with her. Morgan, thanks for dropping by.
Glad to be here.
It is really nice to talk to you finally after all our texting back and forth. But you having a good day today?
I've had an amazing day today. Lots going on, so this is the perfect end to the good day. So this is great.
Paranormally kind of stuff going on?
Not really any paranormally stuff. Just hanging out and working on some articles and whatnot. So I guess that's a little bit on the paranormal side because it's that kind of stuff, but nothing overtly terrifying or anything like that.
It's not happy to get. Let's not start off with terrifying things because it's a relaxing conversation. Let's not have death into it. Oh, hold on, that's the whole idea. Now you co-founded a group, Entity Seeker, Paranormal Research and Teachings, back in 2003. What brought you into that line of investigation or that line of hobby work?
Well, it's funny because I had an incident when I was about 8 or 9 years old that I didn't know what to make of it at the time. I had no context for anything that was paranormal or anything like that, but it frightened me enough because I was so young. I didn't know what I was experiencing. And when I started to look into it a little bit more, I became absolutely consumed by it. I thought this was fascinating, and it was just a phenomenal thing to dig into when you're starting to look into consciousness and the unknown. So my school years were spent very much just enthralled in the study of consciousness and the idea that this world is so built upon the non-physical energies. And then later, about 6 years into forming Entity Seeker with Stephanie Wirtz, I found out my great-great-grandfather founded the first paranormal association in Canada. So it was an amazing tie-in, and something that definitely made me want to push forward even more.
Before we get into your dad's paranormal group, what was the event that sparked it when you were a kid?
When I was a kid, it was interesting. We had a house in BC in Surrey, and we had this sort of, we were part of this fourplex, and we had a number of events that started to go on, like just really random things. We'd hear footsteps and we'd see things, and classic what you'd consider like a haunting. And the one morning I woke up and I heard somebody downstairs, and it was really early. It was very dark. And I came downstairs. It was about, 5 in the morning maybe. And I came downstairs, and the light in the kitchen was on. And from our stairs, you couldn't actually see into the kitchen, but you could tell the light was on. And as I was there and sort of standing there, I said hello, and the footsteps and the noises that I was hearing in the kitchen just quit. And immediately the hair on the back of my neck went up, because my instinct, every fiber of my being was like, that's not your parents. And I thought, my immediate reaction was somebody's broken into the house. And I went to go turn on the living room light, and the light wouldn't click on. And I thought, okay, what am I going to do? And I heard the footsteps leave the kitchen. I saw this opaque form come around the corner and rush at me, and it scared the living bejesus out of me. I was terrified. Apparently I screamed for help. I don't even remember doing it. And my parents came downstairs. They were the same way. They thought somebody had broken in. And my dad went downstairs and he searched the house. And what was interesting was that he went to the light in the living room and he clicked the light on and it came on with no problem. Whatever it was gone. And it scared the crap out of me. But, it also sparked my lifelong interest in this.
I had incidents when I was a little kid, but not, I had the shadows in the room. And then as a teenager, I saw full body apparitions. And then that kind of disappeared after a while. Did yours continue or did you block it out?
I didn't see anything for a long time after that, and it wasn't because I wasn't interested. I was extremely fascinated by the whole thing, but it wasn't until we moved. I guess we moved into a couple of different houses when we were in Surrey, and the house that we moved into not long after that was extremely active, and it's one of those places that if I would love to go back to it if I could go back now with the knowledge that I have, because it was absolutely phenomenal. But there was quite a bit of residual energy there. There was a dog that would manifest and jump on the end of our beds, and we never saw him, but you could feel this dog jump in the end of your bed and lay down, stuff like that. So really, really neat. And I've had stuff happen, periodically throughout my life, but it was, it's fascinating.
Oh, it is. That is crazy. That's, I know we go through a real, or some of us go through this real change as we grow, but we just kind of put that side of our abilities on the back burner.
Yeah.
And I think it comes out when we are placed in a position, this is my own opinion, I think it comes out when we're placed in positions of communicating with other people that, it's not, we're not crazy and these things happen. When we get to a certain point in our life when it's time for us to blossom and come out of the paranormal closet or the intuitive closet, it's right for us at that time. And in your case, look at you. You're bouncing all over the place teaching people about paranormal and lecturing and being a guest professor. But now let's get back into Dr. Albert Durant Watson, your great-grandfather and president of the Association for Physical Research of Canada, founded back in 1918. Yeah, tell us a little bit about that. And like you said, as you were saying earlier, that this is something that you didn't even notice until you were involved in your own Entity Seeker paranormal team.
Yeah, I had no idea. And he's a fascinating guy. He was a very famous physician in Ontario, and he was known all over the place. He was very, very well respected, just really a man of science. He was an astronomer, and he was a poet, and he's just this amazing, talented, open-minded guy, but very science, very much leaned towards the science, because he was a physician. And it wasn't until he started having his friends, I should say, started having these sittings in his house, because his house had space. He had a pretty fair-sized house. And they started to have these sittings with this fellow by the name of Louis Benjamin. And Louis Benjamin essentially was a channel. And my great-great-grandfather, he thought it was ridiculous. He was just like, come on. But yeah, you guys can use my house because I love you, kind of thing. And they would come in, and he started watching, and he started watching these people, and he was fascinated because he realized that, man, he's like, this is a little weird, but maybe I can get in there and debunk it. And he would sit there and started listening to this guy and what he was coming out with. And this guy had a 6th grade education, not all that bright. And when he would slip into these channeling sessions, he just transformed. And he was educated on every subject imaginable, politics and art and all of these different things. And as the sessions went along, A.D. Watson was hearing something that he had not heard from anybody before, which is all this stuff about non-physical energy. This is about consciousness and joy. And he started talking about the idea of, our emotions and our thoughts create our own realities, and all of these different things that was just not talked about at the time. And he became extremely intrigued. And by the end of all these sessions years later, he was absolutely convinced that what he had experienced was real. So he took all his transcripts and he authored 2 books and just put them out there and said, you guys can think whatever you want to think. This is what I experienced. Take it or leave it. And it was absolutely fascinating.
Now, those are the books, I think, was it something to do with the 20th plane?
Yeah, the 20th plane, and then the second one was Birth Through Death, the ethics of the 20th plane. And they're really good.
Oh, so you've read them?
I have both of them, yeah.
Oh, very cool. And I think the 20th plane of psychic revelation reported.
Yes.
Yeah, that was his kind of summary of, not summary, but his investigation into what he was involved in back then.
It was. Yeah.
Now, the group itself, it came out of the Association for Physical Research, came out of England. Psychical research came out of England. That is so cool that about not too long after that one was starting up, this one popped out in Canada. But you also remember back in the teens and into the 20s, it was a big thing to have seances and mediums come to your house if you had the money, and it was socially kind of fun to do, Ouija boards and that kind of thing. As a result of that, these groups, specifically this group, came out of this because people were looking at what some of these psychics and the results of some of these seances and they were doing, and they were kind of looking at them with a science eye. And as a result, that's what really started this thing going. But it was absolutely way ahead of its time. Again, it's if anybody wants to look into it, it's the Association of Psychical Research. There's one of Canada, and there's, I think, the one that without a country attached to it's the one in the UK. They were about the first people to really try to dig down into why I'm hearing this, or why all of a sudden you're speaking French and you've never spoken French before, or how come you described my uncle to a T, right down to his pipe and slippers. So, they were the ones that really took that parlor game into more of a under a microscope.
Well, and even further back than that, in Europe and places like Italy, with people like Ernest Bozzano and people like that, it's been going on for so long, and you go back into even the 1700s and things like that, and you've got these people that are trying to work it out. But I think where A.D. Watson began to change things, and I think the reason he got so much flack at the time, because people really came down on him for this, and I think the reason he got so much flack was because he was the first one to start really introducing the idea that this, getting into things like non-physical consciousness and things like that was something that was joyful. And I think that was one area that they hadn't really clued in, and they really didn't make the true connection until the 1970s in Toronto with the Philip table tipping experiment. And when they got into that, and then they tied the idea of joy into it, that was actually creating some of these manifestations, or that was a significant factor in creating the manifestations. It wasn't until then that his work, I think, really became a little bit more significant to people.
It does go, like you say, back to the 1700s, and anything earlier you get into that whole church issue. It's blasphemy to look into this. Psychics are obviously it's you get into what's her name? It was designed tarot cards and oracle cards. Who's the famous lady whose name I can't remember?
Oh gosh, and you're asking me.
And I'll think of it. But she has found God and is pointing out in the Bible why people shouldn't use all the cards that she's been making for so many years. And my listener is like pounding right now at the computer, going, "No, I know who that is." It was probably held underground a lot just because you didn't want to say it out loud in front of your priest or your very religious mother. So it was held out in the late 1800s with William Barrett and Edmund Rogers and things like that, who basically started at the British National Association for Spiritualists. And I think spiritualists was a nice way of covering up what they were up to. So the church wasn't too bad. I'm a spiritualist. I believe in... Well, I haven't found a psychic yet that doesn't believe in God, so I'm pretty sure these guys are all okay. And that I will phone you like at 4 o'clock in the morning when I remember that lady's name.
Because you will eventually.
Because it's like eventually
it'll hit you.
So, what did Entity Seeker Paranormal Research and Teachings? What was your research, and how did you teach?
Well, we began to realize really early on that there was a tie-in to what our clients and what we were, we go in and we interview clients or whichever, and we began to realize really quickly that there was an emotional connection between what they were experiencing and sort of what they were presenting to the world, both emotionally, energetically, what they're, if they had trauma. We noticed that there was a very strong correlation between where they were, what they had healed or hadn't healed, and the activity that was presenting itself. And when we made that connection, we started to look at it globally, because we thought, okay, if that's key, if that's something that we have to, that we've been noticing here in the West, there has to be more cases where there's been a connection there. And when we began to study it, we began to look at things called blue zones. And blue zones were designated by a fellow by the name of Dan Buttner. He's a freelance journalist from National Geographic. And he basically went around the world, and it's still going on. And they're identifying what they call blue zones, which are basically the happiest places in the world. And they have a list of factors that are, that they consider what is required to be happy. And they go around and they look at all these different places. And there's like Nicoya, Costa Rica, Icaria, Greece, Sardinia, Italy, all sorts of places. And what we found was really interesting was that the places that were more joyful they not only didn't have the same take, like the frightening, this is terrifying take on the paranormal that the West does, but they also had, we couldn't find accounts of people having these horrific experiences. And it was very interesting to us, because as soon as you got into more of the Western culture, you began to see, these people talking about these terrifying things happening to them and whatever. But if you took that story and you went over to Okinawa, Japan, for instance, you started talking about that, they have no idea what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. They don't have that kind of experience. So we had to start asking why. And so what we developed was a program called Teaching the Living. And we began to implement it with our clients, because we realized that it's not about going after whatever that is in non-physical, because we can't do that. But we can turn around and deal with the client, because they're in our here and now. And when we start dealing with them and start getting them into a better emotional state, what we noticed was that the rest of the activities started to die down if they were having something negative. And on the flip side, if they were when they were starting to heal and they were starting to feel better and letting go of that resistance, they started to have the really good experiences, the happy stuff, and seeing the loved ones and things like that. And so basically what I do now, and if I'm bringing people on board, they help me out. But we implement this with not only our clients, but with programs all over the world. I'm going to be at a college here in Edmonton at the end of the month, teaching this to a social work program. I've done psychology programs, all sorts of things, and it's been absolutely amazing to see the change.
I'm just going to recap here really quickly. Let's say you've got one house, and the humans, the living people in there are having a real, like, they're going through marital issues. They're they're having a depressed kind of low vibration life. And across town, you've got the happy people, the high vibration life, but it's an attraction for more negative entities, possibly in that lower one, as opposed to the positive entities.
Absolutely. And what's interesting to watch is that oftentimes those negative entities will be reflective of the trauma that's going on with the people that are in the house. And that's what's really fascinating for us. We had a client recently, actually, who they were having a horrific time. They had a young son who was about 3, and she and her husband, the entity was somewhat respectful of her husband. It was interesting, but would go after her son and her viciously. And it got so bad the one night that they ended up actually having a tug-of-war with this kid and the entity, and they ended up sleeping in their van. Like, they literally would not go back in their house. Like, it was ridiculous. And when we were talking with the wife, we got, I kept asking her about what her history was, and she kept saying, everything's great. I had a great life and everything's cool. And I kept pushing on her, because I was like, this doesn't make any sense. You can't be this joyful and have this stuff happen to you. And finally she came out with it and said, yeah, I just left this really abusive marriage where she was being physically beaten. It was horrible, absolutely domestic violence. And she had left that situation with her son and come into this new marriage and had healed nothing from leaving this traumatic incident. And what was so fascinating was that she'd entered into this new life, kind of compartmentalized this trauma that she'd had. And now this next abuser had come along, except it was something that's non-physical. And it was completely reflective of the trauma that she had just left, but she hadn't dealt with. So as she started to heal that, the activity in the house started to dissipate. And it was really fascinating to watch. But, we see it all the time.
Now, when you say it starts to dissipate and it's fascinating to watch, how long and what do you use to watch that?
Depends on the tools that the person needs. I mean, every single case is different. Everybody's version of happy is different. And, what your version of happy is necessarily going to be the client's. So you got to figure it out with them. What is it that is going to get you to living your best life? What does that look like? And so it depends on the person. And you kind of start to shape that, and you use the resources in your community. You use the psychologists. You use the people that are, trained in this stuff. You bring in who you have to bring in. And, our point is that, we're the compass. We're not the solution. The client's got to do the work. But if they do the work and they put the time in, it's going to change their life.
Oh yeah, we ran into about a year and a half ago a fellow out in Windsor, Ontario, whose son, who was was a surviving twin at birth, but had mental health issues due to problems at birth, and was living with his dad. And when the mom left them, the mom went off to kind of sow her wild oats, and the young fella, I'll say he's in his late 20s, he couldn't deal with it. And all of a sudden, things started happening around the house. Like the father's bed would shake all night long. It would just rock and rattle, and things were getting thrown around the house. And when we did a remote viewing of it, yes, the place was absolutely filled with dead people, going back to the 1600s, right up to children who died in a hospital a few blocks away. And it was because of the fireworks going out at the top of this guy's head, this kid. He was attracting every dead person, plus his energy was at the point where he possibly subconsciously was blaming his dad and was driving his dad nuts. It was crazy. Yeah. And we cleared a lot of the ghosts out of there, and which pulled a lot of energy out that this kid was feeding on too. And the bed only shook from 3 till 6 in the morning. And then, we sent the child off to the side. We got the dad to send the child off to psychologist and to work with some anger issues, hopefully. And then also told him to get lessons in meditation, not just to look online, but because of his special needs, he needed to be guided through meditation and taught. And after all that, things really calmed down.
Yeah, it's everything. People don't understand the importance of your own joy, and it's interesting to watch because people, especially in the West, and the blue zones are such a fantastic example of what happiness can end up bringing you, because here in the West, we very much prize the idea of busyness and hard work and sacrifice, and the more you sacrifice and the more you bleed, the more deserving you are. It's a very toxic mentality, and wherein you go to a place like the blue zones, and it's so interesting because they really prize things like family time, relaxation, living your passion, having support around you, making sure that you've got the right people around you to lift you up. They see success very differently, and most of the blue zones do not consider money on the list of what makes you successful. So it's a really fascinating thing to watch. But you see them, like you see most of the places out there, which I find very fascinating. They have an almost 0 to no risk of or rate of cancer, of Alzheimer's. They live extremely long, and when they do pass away, they pass away in their sleep. It's very, very peaceful, very quiet. Nice. Loma Linda, California, which is a blue zone, they have the longest living people in the world. That's not an accident.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Isn't it?
Very interesting, yeah. Wow. We're talking to the affable. I always wanted to say the word affable. It's kind of cool. Morgan Knudsen, she is a paranormal lecturer, presenter, and author, and bounces around all over the place. You can see her in all sorts of shows. Now, what's the let's see. I'm going through my list of all the stuff you've been in. What is the most recent television episode of what have you been up to?
Well, the current 2 shows are Paranormal 911 and Haunted Hospitals.
Oh, those are crazy. You don't want to go in a hospital. They're full of dead people. Those are wonderful places, like theaters, hospitals, schools, heck, churches and pubs. You want to see a ghost. And you want to see a nurse who doesn't want to leave because she's still working. Hang out in a hospital for a while. Have you been involved in the really researching the science, like we've talked about in the paranormal right from the beginning, or is this something that's developed as you've kind of got your own knowledge and through interviews of people and with talking and your own research, you've kind of come up with this view, and I shouldn't say view, but you've come up with a fact pattern that has led you in broadening a little more of your understanding of what happens on the other side. Was it something you started with, or is it something that developed as you grew into the I hate to call it a science, but the paranormal investigation side of things?
Yeah, I think I've always wanted to come at it from a very factual angle, because one of the things that bothered me very much from an early age was the fact that these people were throwing around buzzwords. People would throw around buzzwords like energy, or they would pull out tools and things like that really they weren't using properly, or there was just a lot of conjecture, and I had a lot of questions that kind of went beyond the conjecture. It was like, okay, how do you know this? How do we know this? And oftentimes, you dig into those questions and there was no answer. They didn't know, but they were presenting it very factually. And so for me, it was like, okay, if we're gonna step into the world of the skeptics and helping clients and things like that, we got to get rid of that, because ultimately, if we're throwing around those buzzwords, somebody's gonna catch on, because I did. And I was like, okay, what can we observe? What can we look at? What do we know for sure? And what patterns can we follow? And what do we know? So that was always my objective. And what came with that was, okay, what in the environment do I need to be aware of that's going to affect my perception? So in terms of gear or meters or anything like that, I had 2 main objectives. One was I want to document every possible thing I can with as many pieces of equipment in terms of audio, video, registering electromagnetics, all sorts of things like that. And I want to make sure that whatever I'm using, I know what the hell I'm measuring. Because that's one of the things that drives me nuts, especially on some of the TV shows, is just watching people misuse equipment. And, it turns around when you get a scientist or a physicist or anything like that comes in, it makes people look laughable, and it makes the field laughable, that's not good.
Oh, yeah. It's some of the shows that have really promoted, that I kind of thank for promoting the idea that there is something after death and getting people to think about it. They're bloody stupid. Like, yeah. I have a classic show that there's one of them that I will not watch because I know people. I know David Oman. I've been to his house out in L.A. and he's got ghosts and things, and they screwed up investigations there. They lied when they get on TV, and it's just horrible. But they come up with all the fancy equipment and things, and if you're here, touch me, and then they get touched and start screaming. But equipment. And one of the things I always jump on too is those EMF meters. Don't get a $4,000 one, because you'll get EMF all over the place. Get the cheap Chinese one, and if it goes off, then figure out why it goes off. Don't just say, "Oh, it's going off because a ghost has set it off."
And the thing is well, exactly, and the thing is, what people don't realize about things like EMF meters is that they're not calibrated to figure out to read ghosts, because we don't know what a ghost is made of. We can't calibrate a meter to figure that out. So it's basic things like that I want people to become critically aware of what an EMF meter does. What do the different types do? Yeah. Is this one reading cellular signal? Is this one reading like electronics and wiring? Is this one reading natural EMF? There's a whole subcategory there. And most people have no idea what they're doing. I often see on the TV shows people walking around with a tri-field meter. You can't walk with a tri-field meter. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah,
it's going to go off.
Itself is going to, yeah.
Exactly. So it's so things like that. I think there's I'm fine with the shows coming out and saying that they're entertainment, and saying, this is entertainment, this is great, so on and so forth. But when my problem begins is when they start billing it as real. And it's like, well, hold on. Because if you're billing it as a documentary, that changes the game.
Yes.
So, it's something that's important. It's one of the reasons why I got involved with haunted hospitals and paranormal 911 was because they really wanted to do a journalistic approach to telling the stories of first responders and doctors and nurses. And it wasn't about, creating an environment or creating something that the audience was supposed to believe. It was about supporting these people and telling their stories. And that changed the game for me. I was on board immediately.
And that's one of the things we do here on this show is that we walk into it saying, yes, ghosts exist. Okay, now what do? We don't, not looking for them all the time. Oh, let's go look. One of the documentaries I was involved in, my 2 or 3 pieces of equipment, one was a night vision camera, one was a digital recorder, I had a couple of them, and the other one was a piece of string.
Mm-hmm.
That was it. And then we explained how, things would work. And it was funny. We used the string as a trigger. We would say, hang it up in this very haunted location and say, if somebody's here, could you touch the string? And, of course, on the audio, we pick up some disembodied voice saying, don't touch the string. So
that's funny.
Yeah, we had Ghost 1 telling Ghost 8 to 10 or whatever, okay, don't touch it. We're not playing with these guys.
That is absolutely hilarious.
Yeah, but those are the kind of things we do, but there's so much. I remember those cheap made-in-China gray EMF detectors, you used to pick them up for $30 to $40. Now, because of the whole paranormal thing, they're $180 to $100. It's like, on what? Hopefully some construction worker doesn't pick it up and try to use it, or electrician, because it's really screwy. There are people who frustrate me, the ghost hunters, and it's because I've been involved in so many groups of people hunting ghosts and finding them and then charging people to come out and look at the ghosts that they found. But I love what you're doing. I love the idea of digging in deeper into the why at the location as opposed to the who.
I think you have to. Yeah, exactly. Like I think and becomes less important. And because oftentimes when we get clients that come out and they're asking, if they're asking for help or something like that, they're not having a good time. Usually, thank God, most of the cases that, we hear about and deal with, they're really positive. But you get the ones that are not so fun. And usually the people that are asking for help are those people. So but what I would really want to press upon is the fact that, you get those cases, but not only is there an element of this that's in your control, but also the research and the majority of the things that people experience are so incredible. And if people could just embrace the idea that some of this stuff can be so joyful, and the majority of it changes your relationship with non-physical and your idea of death. That that concept becomes not irrelevant, but you begin to look at it with a lot less fear than you would if you were really stuck with the idea that this was a terrible thing and you're gonna die and get stuck and all of this stuff. That like, no, you know what? Take a step back. Take a look at the paperwork, take a look at the real thing, and you see something that is so incredible. And that's the one thing that I get to do, and I'm so thankful about on Paranormal 911, because we get all of these cases from these first responders, and some of them are the most beautiful stories that, if you thought you were alone before, man, you sure aren't by the time you're done this.
Oh, yeah. It's amazing from all my years as in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and going to actually check on next of kin and finding them passed.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how many times when I'm there, I'm just very quiet, going through the drawers and checking their meds and waiting for the coroner or the medical examiner or whoever where I am. And the other times I'll go into a similar situation and I'm talking to the deceased person.
Yeah.
And this is before I found any of this woo-woo stuff out connected to me. And in hindsight, I look back going, oh, yeah, because the guy probably hadn't crossed. So my subconscious was telling me, okay, explain to him what you're doing and why. And why you're going through his drawers, why you're looking at his meds, why you're taking pictures, and I swear the next day I do an identical thing and keep it completely quiet.
Yeah.
So now I'm just like, why am I talking to one guy? And then the stuff that I've heard and the things that I were involved in and, looking across a field and seeing people from the waist up and thinking, okay, it's because of the heat coming off the ground, and then realizing, no, those are people from the 1800s.
Yeah, nobody's standing there. Yeah. Well, and one of probably the best stories that I still relate on Paranormal 911 was this amazing case. It was two EMS responders, and they came to this house. A husband had called in. His wife was having a heart attack, and they came in, and when they went up to the house, it was extremely dark. It was like nobody was home. And they were a little weirded out by that, so they thought, you know what, we'll call the police just in case. So they put the call out for the police, and they go into the house. They get in there, and on the main floor, the husband's sitting in the living room. He's really quiet, and he said, oh, my wife's upstairs. I think she's having a heart attack. And they said, okay, no problem. Stay put. We'll be right back. So they go upstairs, and they're talking to the wife, and yeah, sure enough, like she was full cardiac arrest at this point, and she was, having trouble breathing and all of that. So as this is going on, they're checking her out. Police show up, and they meet the husband outside. The husband's like, yeah, EMS is here. They just went upstairs. So the police officer was like, hey, no problem. Asked him if he wanted to ride the ambulance. He's, those the normal questions. And they wait outside. The EMS people who are upstairs, you know what, don't worry, ma'am, it's okay. We've got the ambulance here. Come downstairs. Your husband will come with us. And she went white as a sheet and looked at them. And long story short, her husband had passed away a month ago. And when they came downstairs, of course, the police officer was like, oh, is her husband coming and riding in the ambulance? And they said, no, her husband's gone. And they had the pamphlet from his funeral. But this guy called 911. Not only did he wait for EMS and the police officer, he called dispatch.
Good for him.
It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing.
One of the hospitals out here in Vancouver, British Columbia, it's a very old hospital, and the closed down wing, which is opening up in the next few months, the security guards report the phone's ringing in there. And it's not a big deal until they actually pick the phone up on the desk and hand it to you, because there's no cords on it.
That's fascinating.
And it's not one of the new digital ones. It's those heavy, clunky ones from, they're the push-button ones, so they're from the 80s and earlier, but there's no wires on it, and they'll hear ringing, and they'll look in, and they'll see the light flashing on it, unlock the door, and pick it up, and then realize, no, this phone is actually not hooked up.
Yeah.
So can they phone? Can they connect? I'd say yes.
Yeah, they seems to be able to. A really good friend of mine in the UK, Dr. Cal Cooper, he actually wrote a book on it called Telephone Calls from the Dead. And he's a clinical parapsychologist there, and he studied that for quite a while. And yeah, I mean, it happens more frequently than what we realize.
Oh, it is crazy. The stories that you hear once you get somebody talking, especially in the first responder field and the hospitals, especially around hospitals. It's at the dog park here. I'm talking to a nurse whose husband is an emergency room doctor, and she's an emergency room nurse. Actually, they were featured on a television series about the emergency room, and they had a girl come in from a car accident and pass away, a 17-year-old girl. And then they were busy, so they wheeled her out and wheeled a guy in with a liver problem. And he was lying on the table, holding onto his liver, moaning, and then he started yelling, "Get her out of here, get her out of here." And he described the 17-year-old girl who had passed away in the hospital room 20 minutes earlier. He said she's standing in the corner screaming about, where is she? So she had stepped out of the body, they moved the body, and now she hasn't quite crossed over, and she's freaking out. And this guy was intuitive enough to actually not only hear her but see her, and it upset him to the point that, and of course he'd never been intuitive before in his life, but I think maybe the pain and everything else was going on, and her extremely strong presence came through. So my God. Yeah,
well, in the medical profession too, the sad thing is that they're really told not to talk about it. And there's a stigma around the idea that, if you're a physician or, a nurse or something like that, you shouldn't be talking about this stuff. That's for crazy people. And that's a stigma that needs to be broken. And that's what we're hoping to do with these two shows is to try to break that stigma down, because ultimately, there are, I think, major factors and stories that need to be heard, like both on for the scientific community, but also just for the layman, that this is not the end. And I think they carry a lot of weight. I mean, these first responders, for instance, they get a call and then they go into these situations. They don't have a dog in the fight. They're just told somebody's sick, show up. Yeah. And, they have no reason to lie about this stuff. Absolutely none. They're just going in there to treat the patient. And, whatever happens to them, around that happens. And I think that has to be paid attention to.
You're totally right. And not only do they have no dog in the fight, they would rather not be hanging out there going, yeah, I'm the one who saw the alien pop out from behind the bed and kick the ghost into a box and move on. It's like, what? Oh,
yeah, mind. Absolutely.
My buddy John D'Souza, who is ex-FBI, he wrote a book a few years ago on, I think it was 52 stories, all from police. And what they saw while they're at work, whether it was a UFO or a ghost or what they heard and things like that. But, of course, the names had to be changed to protect the fellows you're going to coffee with, because who wants to, some of the guys had retired and it was fine and they gave their name, but John D'Souza himself had been seeing UFOs since he was a kid, and it was his case files as a young policeman. He would get those and get the UFO ones all the time. And eventually it was those case files that were picked up and taken to Hollywood, and that's how the X-Files actually started, from the stuff that he worked on.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah,
it makes sense.
Yeah, it's amazing, but it's that first responder, because you're there quick around dead. Oh, here's one for you. I pull up to a car accident in northern Alberta. Pretty minor car accident, it looked like. The lady standing out in the passenger side of the car, looking into the car. I tell dispatch where I am. I get everything ready. I walk out, put my fancy hat on. Well, it's not that fancy. And, okay, the lady's gone. So I thought she's maybe in the other car. I wonder where my witness is, and she was actually the deceased who was sitting in the driver's seat of her car.
That's amazing.
So what had happened was she took a step out and was looking at herself, and with that, oh my, what do I do now? And she probably got a tap on the shoulder, and off she went. And, well, I missed the tap on the shoulder. I just happened to glance up and see her there.
Yeah, that's amazing.
We could go for a beer and we could talk about this all night. You've got a radio show. You're on a podcast. Tell me a little bit about that. What's it called?
Yeah, so I do a monthly show called Ghosts of the Great White North on Spaced Out Radio, and it's once a month, third Wednesday of every month. We just hash out all sorts of stuff about the paranormal. We talk about spirituality. And we try to bring guests on that are really educational and will help further people's understanding in the best way possible. Actually, my friend Dr. Cal Cooper, he was on there in February. We've had some really interesting individuals on, and we cover all sorts of things, not just spirits and things like that, but we cover everything from cryptozoology to all sorts of stuff. But we try to make it about Canada, because Canada doesn't seem to be talked about all that much. It kind of gets missed in the field of the paranormal. So trying to bring that back a little bit.
Yeah. Hey, don't tell anybody. All of a sudden we'll get all sorts of people up here thinking there's ghosts, which there are, because they're everywhere, for goodness sakes.
Of course.
Get from Dawson City in the Yukon to Vancouver, British Columbia. My gosh, Montreal, and the battles that they had, the wars.
The Hannah Valley and Northwest Territories.
Oh, good Lord, they're all over the place. And, we have a lot of moving water here. We've got lots of rivers and oceans pounding at the shores of these, and of course the coastal areas where the first settlers go. So drawing from that energy, they're a little easier to see in places on the east and west coast. And so if you're Canadian and you don't think there are paranormal teams, heck, if you live in Edmonton, get a hold of Morgan and see what she can help you with. Maybe go on one of, you guys still do the walks out there?
Yeah, I try to keep the classes running in the summers and into the fall, and it's really cool because I get to show people firsthand, some of the amazing history and whatnot behind in Edmonton, Alberta. And it's really, really neat for people because half the time, they're like, we get people from all over the place. We've had people from Russia, we've had people from Glasgow, we've had all over the place. And, it's neat for them to come in and see it, but it's also really cool for Edmontonians to come out because half the time they don't realize, that they're driving past these places all the time. So I try to make that accessible to people. And I have another class that is done in a limo bus as well. And we're able to drive around the city, and it's called Fireside Ghost Experience. And I take people, it's like a rolling parapsychology class. We basically are able to pile on this bus, and there's hot chocolate and apple cider and things like that. And we go around the city, and I teach them. So it's not necessarily, you hear sort of the ghost story aspect of it, but they walk away educated too. It's fun, and it's the way it makes people remember it. So I think it's a good way for people to learn.
Now, what is your website?
Website is entityseeker.ca.
entityseeker.ca. So if you're playing along at home, everybody, entityseeker.ca, you'll find a little bit more about Morgan Knudsen out of Edmonton, Alberta. And if you don't know where Edmonton is, you're not watching enough hockey.
So true.
It's the Americans. It's how you pick a Canadian city. If doesn't have a professional hockey team, how do we know where it really is? Where's this Victoria, British Columbia? Now, hey, I got to run something by you, fellow radio person. So I've got this Patreon thing. Are you familiar with what Patreon is?
I know Patreon.
Yeah, it's if I have a listener that likes what we're talking about, I'm asking for a donation of $3, which works out at $36 a year, I think. And with that, when I hit the 20 people mark, because I have just started, we will get a monthly draw, 3 draws, one for a psychic reading, one for a past life regression, and one for a numerology chart. And if I get lucky enough to get to 2,222 people, I will be drawing names once a month for trips. So if you're, down in California and you want to come up to Edmonton to go on your tour, we'll fly you and somebody else up, airfare, accommodations, and transportation. Or if you're from Edmonton and want to go down to Florida and see something spooky, or Louisiana, there's some stuff in New Orleans that I've got a really good hookup with some paranormal groups down there. It will take you to places that will make your skin crawl. Brothels going back to the 1700s and things are just crazy. Or ghost battlefields, whether it's a Civil War battlefield like Gettysburg, or any of the other burgs out there, or UFO conferences all over. Bigfoot conferences down, again, Louisiana, Tennessee, up into Washington State. I'll be hitting up the Bigfoot conference last weekend in August in Kennewick, Washington, the International Bigfoot conference there. So I think it's kind of a nice way to give back, and it's I'm trying to get people more involved. And if you're thinking that, well, I'm kind of a shut-in, I'm kind of stuck in a wheelchair, well, there's a ticket for the other person to come with you, and we'll build the tour around whatever you want. So it's all for you to check that off your bucket list. And so I'm always asking people what they think of that.
I think that's really cool because I think whatever, and I love the fact that you're accommodating the wheelchair side of it, because my business partner, when she was still alive, Stephanie, she had muscular dystrophy, and she never let the wheelchair stop her, and so she never did. This girl, she never complained. I never heard a complaint out of her mouth, and right up until the day she passed away. So I think don't let it stop you, and I think, being able to take advantage of a trip and things like that, you can't really understand these places or this phenomenon without actually getting out there and stepping out and being in these locations, because you can read about them all you want, but it's like Gandalf said in The Hobbit, the world is not in your books and maps; it's out there. And so I think it's a great idea, and I think people should take advantage of whatever chance they get to explore.
Yeah, it's. I think it'd be fun, and plus, if we get up to that 3,000, 3,500 mark now, and I draw your name and end up sending you from Pasadena, California, to Glasgow, Scotland. I'm going to hook you up with a couple of groups there, and you get to see different angles and different opinions on the same thing, which would be kind of cool. And plus, honestly, it's an open-ended ticket. So if you want to add some other people onto it and stay a month, heck, you're in Europe. I got you there. Might as well hang out a little bit longer and go from there. And the same for my friends in Australia. There's some really good cryptid conferences down there, UFOs all over the place, and of course all the ghost conferences that I'll send you down to, from UK to Australia to North America, or what they like to call America. I want to send some people around. Plus, I get to go with them, which is kind of fun.
See, there's a bonus.
Yeah, there's the bonus. Plus, I'll probably I'll grab somebody and we'll videotape the interviews. We'll make a podcast adventure out of it, and it's a self-feeding machine. So it
really is.
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about is I noticed, and it's kind of cool, that you're an award-winning human of paranormal. How the heck do you get an award for paranormal stuff?
I was actually given the award for outstanding service to the city of Edmonton, actually, from Edmonton Tourism for my education programs, and it was awesome for all the work that I did with Entity Seeker and the tours and the workshops and whatnot. So all of the classrooms, and it was really, really cool. They put me up at Hotel McDonald, which is a part of the Fairmont line here in Edmonton, for a night, and it was a blast. I was very, very happy, because normally that just recognition doesn't usually happen like that.
Kidding. It was awesome.
Yeah,
it's awesome. You and Wayne Gretzky got it, so it's very cool.
There we go.
Yeah. Well, and staying in that hotel, it's, speaking of haunted. So, you're going to put me up in that hotel? Okay, I've got a bunch of gear I need to bring and set it up all over the place and turn it into... Actually, no, they're paying for it. Never mind. It's when you pay for it yourself. Let's see if I can write this off by bringing a bunch of gear in. Yeah, that'd be fun. Did you ever get anything out of the hotel there?
It was really cool, actually. We had there was but I had myself and a couple of team members there with me, and it was really cool. We had an interesting incident in one of the hallways where I had an EMF meter, and it went off. It sparked where it shouldn't have sparked, and it was picking up some fluctuation in electromagnetics. And at the same time, it was interesting. My fellow that I work with, who's extremely intuitive, just before that had tripped. He started getting that there was somebody there, and was describing was almost sounded like almost like a porter type character, and the meter started going off, and at the same time, which was fascinating, we were getting this ball of light in our camera, and we couldn't see it with the naked eye. It was just this bright ball of light, and we followed it all the way down one of the hallways, and the meter kept tripping, like it was giving off electromagnetic signal, and when the ball of light disappeared, the meter quit, and it disappeared. And so it was pretty neat.
Oh, that would be fabulous. Absolutely fabulous.
It was a good night.
I love old hotels. Out in Victoria, BC, we've got the Empress. I was down in Port Townsend, Washington at, I just had the name at the top. Doreen Virtue. No.
Virtue, there we go. Yeah.
That's the lady with the cards whose name I forgot. And she's knocked the name of the hotel. The Manresa Castle, which at one point was it was really not a castle, it was just a really fancy house. And some kids died there. Some children and adults died in the home, and then it was taken over by the Jesuits. And there was a story about a guy committing suicide, one of the priests. But it is lovely haunted. And just talking to the people that work there about the kids that walk around the halls upstairs and move stuff on them, it's brilliant. But I love hotels. One of those.
Yeah, they're a blast.
Yeah, heck, if you're going to, it's them in theaters. I find are just packed with
you've got so much human emotion there, right? Like there's so much human activity and so much human emotion that, you know, as soon as you mix that together, then, you know, you've got the recipe for a haunting, right? So I mean, it makes complete sense. You know, everybody's thinking, oh, it's the cemeteries that are haunted. Well, not usually. You know, you go into these places that have a lot of people and a lot of you know, joy and excitement,
it's
and
positive energy.
up and down. Absolutely.
Yeah,
you know,
it's schools, churches, theaters, pubs.
Absolutely.
There's some negative stuff, but it's usually not coming out in the forefront. Hospitals, again, you just have a lot of busy people. Like, you know, I go by the 4 reasons for people not crossing over. The children who basically it's stranger danger and they're going to wait for mom and dad. Those who still think they're alive, which is a kind of a lower group, not a lot of them. And plus, that's why you never walk into a house and say, hey, do you know you're dead? And then you get to leave and go home, and the poor homeowner's got to deal with what you've just done, with things bouncing off the walls. Those who still have a job to do, and they perceive they need to help. And that's why you get the nurses still hanging out, and a lot of construction people. And we have in one of our nice theaters here, we've got a lighting guy from the 1920s who fell, and he's still working on the lights because his job isn't done. And then, of course,
and I think some of those too are residual energy. I think when you've got something that's made an impact in some way, then you get that repetitive image that keeps coming back. We've got a hospital here that's got a fellow who you see him working on a boiler all the time, but it's just, you know, it's that energetic imprint.
Yes,
it's like environmental memory, you know, and it just repeats itself.
Yeah, and that's totally different from the human leftovers. The spirits. The other one is, of course, is the fear of something you've done and it's going to send you to hell, or a religious belief. But yeah, the residual, that was interesting. I always go back to that classic little film strip of the spirit going from one tree to another tree on the battlefield of Gettysburg, and they used to call it, oh, this is the famous Gettysburg ghost. But why is it on a reel?
That's very funny.
Yeah, it's because it's same with those ghosts that pop out of the trenches in Belgium. They're just very high vibration people, absolutely terrified and filled with adrenaline for a 30-second point, or they imprint, and they could have died long after the war or 200 feet from where you see them. But it's not like 1,000 people coming out of the trenches. It's, you know, sporadic, so it kind of narrows it down to the high vibe. Yeah,
well, it's interesting with Gettysburg too that you bring that up because the one thing that they're tying into residual energy right now is the idea of the geology behind some of these places. And the one thing that they're finding is specifically in Gettysburg is that they are sitting on top of a quartz bed, which does all sorts of weird things with electromagnetics, and they've tied the idea of electromagnetics very much into residual energy for quite a long time. And it's the idea that the environment on some level can be like a tape and can get recorded. And they still don't know how that's happening, but they're pretty sure that high electromagnetics in an environment has got something to do with that. So it's interesting that they're reading these fluctuations in a place like Gettysburg. And what's fascinating to me about that is that the Edmonton River Valley, which has had a number of just bizarre incidents happen over the years that I've done classes and stuff like that down there. We have a very similar geological makeup here because we used to have a active volcano, and there's interesting electromagnetic fluctuations in the Edmonton River Valley that very much mirror the Gettysburg field. So that's always a point of interest for me, is that I wonder if that's tied together. I think we're going to figure that out probably in the next number of years.
Yeah, it is. We talk about that quite a lot on the show. The quartz under the city of Tombstone, or the old town of Tombstone, Arizona.
Yeah.
It's not, or even being around moving water. That's what, people say, oh man, I don't know, this old ghost town, it sure is haunted. It is an old gold mine or a silver mine. But they're built right beside a moving water, and they have high quartz content in the ground. So you've got
and you're going to get
water.
that high level.
Yeah,
right?
That's it. It's not that they're any more haunted than anywhere else. It's just that they can draw energy to the point where you can see them.
Well, I don't even know if it's necessarily it's drawing energy, but I think the ability for the environment to be able to record is a really high possibility. My theory is, and I think this is where parapsychology is going to eventually go with it, is the idea that, you know, the environment on some level, it acts like a magnetic strip. And under those right conditions, you get this recording of you know, these high emotionally impacted incidents. You know, and I think you might be right in terms of like the, you know, the point of vibration might have very much something to do with that. You know, we forget the fact that our, you know, that when we have high levels of emotion, our bodies and our brains are reacting on a very chemical level. And, you know, our neurons are firing at a rapid rate. Our heart rate goes up. You know, we're releasing different hormones and chemicals and whatever. And then it's like, bam, it's almost like we leave this sort of gunpowder imprint in the environment. And I think we're going to figure out how that works, you know, in the next number of years.
Yeah, it's something we talk, like, again, we talk about a lot, but when I was describing it, it was more to do with actual ghosts, both that have crossed over and haven't crossed over, especially in Tombstone, because they see them walking around all over the place. And not just the cowboys, they're right up to people who lived there 10 years ago. And
I believe that, yeah.
They're still hanging out, and and those little gold mine towns are a gold mine when it comes to actually getting people seeing them and photographing them. The residual energy is fascinating. I was out doing a paranormal investigation, and I think it was my second one. Well, and while I was recording or having a conversation with a disembodied woman in one room, residual energy, a guy pushing a little hand truck out of what's now an office, came around the corner and straight right through the camera of the guy taking the photos of it. It was the most amazing thing. But you could tell that he didn't see us because he wasn't there.
Sure.
And and talking to my some cohorts out in Belgium and Europe, when they talk about those, I can't remember the Finnish or the Flemish term is for the beings that come up out of the ground in the fog in the morning kind of thing. They're just a spattering of either German or Allied soldiers that, again, had such fear and had such a natural higher vibration. They imprinted, and they're on a loop. And why are they on that loop? And what is in the ground that's there? Like what makes that happen? And it's a fascinating line of investigation. And you know, it's just one of those things that's has always kind of tweaked my interest, is that whole residual energy. And then I'm lucky enough to ask an alien or ask a psychic and what they think or what they can communicate to me. So I get that out of the way pretty quick.
Well, residual energy is always funny. Probably one of my funniest stories about that was we were investigating a mission in Lac La Biche, which burned down. But when it was still around, we had set up quite a number of cameras and whatnot in this one area. There was 3 buildings in this one area of the mission, and you know, it's just policy. Everybody's phones have to be shut off and things like that. And you know, so this one area had originally had been an office. It was completely, most gutted, other than a desk and a couple of other things in there. And we left the cameras running, and when we got the footage back, you know, we're listening to the audio, and I started hearing this office phone go off, start ringing, and it rang, and I was like, you got to be kidding me. What idiot, after we just lectured these people about, you know, the phone and power and blah, 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 and they've got this freaking phone ringing, and it ticked me off. And this probably rang for, like, it would ring and then quit, and then it would ring, and it was through, I'd say, 90% of the footage. And I was like, this is ridiculous, because I said, I can't even use this. So I ended up, I called the mission. I said, look, I was like, you know, do you guys have this office phone in there and whatever? And they were like, no, we don't. I was like, what do you mean? They're just like, there's no phone in there. They're like, there's no phone line going in there. There's no phone. And but it was a landline phone. I mean, at the time there wasn't really, you know, cell phones weren't very popular at that point. And it was a real laugh. So we ended up with, like, I don't know how many hours of this the residual energy, this office phone ringing. It was fantastic. It's really funny. Now,
do you think residual energy would ring a phone, or do you think something else was doing it? Because
no, I think it's just the imprint of the noise. You know, it seems to be like a record player, like a needle on a phonograph. And I had another incident where we were investigating a museum, and I don't know how long, it was a very similar incident where, we told them, we're like, look, you guys got to shut things down and whatever. And we got our footage back, and all we could hear was a radio going. We were like, what in the world? Like, who's got their bloody... And you could tell it was in the building. Like, you could tell it was coming over speakers in the building. I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. These people didn't shut their radio off. There was no radio, but they've been playing the radio for, however many nights, over a period of time and whatever. And it just somehow it imprinted into the space. But... it just seems to be this, a needle on a phonograph. You've got this, vinyl record that's pretty boring until you put the needle on it. And then all of a sudden, you've got this beautiful music. And that seems to be how residual energy works. But what that factor is, what the needle is the big question.
Okay, because I look at it as residual energy is basically a imprint from a higher or repetitive energy. So there's a conundrum that you and I have. I have a different view on it. But I'm going to start looking at it through your eyes now and see if it resonates a little bit more with the residual energy and the haunting and the equipment sounds and stuff that we get, and see if there's something connected, because a lot of times we'll get voices too.
Yep.
And
often.
Yeah, I don't pick that up as residual though, because they're communicative.
Well, some of them aren't, right? Like, and I think when you get the ones that are purposely interacting, that's very different.
Yeah.
But the ones that don't seem to be, the ones that seem to be, reflective of something that has happened, I think is something else. And it was funny, Stephanie, when she was still alive, she had this condo, and she had residual energy in her condo, and it was the strangest thing. Her sister used to get up and early in the morning and go to work and make breakfast, and she would go out to the kitchen and she'd clang around the kitchen, and she'd go to Stephanie lived in this tower, one of the condo turrets. So she had these huge wraparound windows that had these massive blinds that you'd have to haul open in the morning. And her sister would go and open all these blinds up. And I remember I was sleeping over at Steph's place the one night because we'd just done a night of research, and we both woke up in the morning and we heard her sister just going around the kitchen and opening the blinds and doing her thing. And I thought, oh God, okay, making all this noise. I just left her alone, and then all the noise just stopped. And I went out to the kitchen, and I noticed, it's pretty clean. Okay, she's gone to work, and it turned out we found out her sister never came home that night. There was nobody in the house, but you could hear her, and it was really quite funny. Like, you could hear, what sounded like what she did every single morning, just repeating itself. But
yeah.
What caused that? I have no idea.
That's that whole the old doppelganger effect, where in Denmark or Norway they would have somebody come home, and they'd hear them open the door and kick their boots off and hang their coat up and come up the stairs, and nobody was there. And then 5 minutes later, that's exactly what would happen. But it was it was like foreshadowing. It was always right before the real thing happened. And my cousins in a small town called Didsbury, Alberta, lived in a doctor's house from the 1920s and 30s. And it was one of those houses where a typical small town doctor, if you're in the rural area and it was surrounded by farms, you'd bring somebody who was sick in, and he could stay overnight and be monitored by the doctor. And people eventually passed away in this house. And one of the things that was interesting about that was my cousin would one night came home, and the typical mom always had sleeping with that one ear, waiting for the kids to come home. And sure enough, here's him pull in the driveway, get out of the car, come in, do the whole thing, come down the hall, and go in the bedroom. Well, 10 minutes later, exactly the same sounds, and now she and her husband, my uncle, get up. Like, who the hell's coming home? Who's coming in the house now? Because we've accounted for everybody. And it was the kid coming home. And she said, well, you came home 5 to 10 minutes ago. And he said, no, not me. So,
that's funny.
But what it's interesting about those is they always happen. I shouldn't say always, but the term that was used to describe them, which was the foreshadow or forebearer of whatever was coming, it always, you heard it, and then within 20 minutes, the real person would come. So
It's interesting.
yeah, what is that all about? That was kind of crazy.
Yeah, it would be interesting to watch the timeline on that, because like I've noticed with residual energy specifically, it seems to be something that's always happened, either recent past or past whatever, but it always seems to, like you say, oftentimes be very repetitive, and it can be very predictable. Sometimes, like, you'll get, for example, we had one incident where there was a card game that happened. I think it was every Tuesday night for God knows how many years. It was something like 20 years or something like that, and this guy always hosted this card game, and when it stopped, years later, you could still hear the conversation of this card game going on, which was kind of cool. And so, yeah, it would be interesting. But I also have a friend of mine who has a doppelganger, and he can't keep a maid in his house because he it scares the crap out of the maid. They'll be in the bedroom or something like that, and she'll think that he's walking through the house, and she goes to talk to him, and he's not there. Yeah. So and that gets really strange too, and that's a whole nother branch of this phenomenon. So God, we could break it down for hours.
Oh, I know it's crazy. A friend of mine,
it's amazing.
A First Nations woman and son that walked from one corner of his house we crossed through the living room, up behind the TV, and kitty corner to another house, and all the neighbors see them.
That's amazing.
It's just like, okay, we're obviously on a path that these people used to take all the time.
All the time, exactly. Yeah.
It's just repetitive. Here's my typical question for a paranormal investigator, parapsychologist. What do you think happens to us after our meat sack no longer functions?
From what I've come to understand, I firmly believe that our consciousness is not emergent from the brain. I think our consciousness is fundamental, and it's what David Chalmers calls the hard problem. But I really believe that after what I've been able to see and research, and I think where parapsychology is headed, I think we're beginning to understand a different model of the brain at this point. And we've got some of the best minds in the world on this now, like neurologists and psychologists, and the best universities in the world have parapsychology labs now. And I think from everything that has been uncovered and discovered, and what I know and experienced myself, I really believe that we are part of something that is we can't really comprehend, and everybody's got a word for it, but I think there's a collective consciousness that's present. I think we are translating that consciousness through our brains, and just like our eyes translate light, and our tongue translates taste, I think our brain translates consciousness, and we're a direct line to that. And I think when our bodies pass away, and we either pass away from unnatural circumstances or natural circumstances, there is no doubt in my mind that consciousness is aware and is attentive and alert, and is very much aware of the loved ones that we feel have been left behind.
What's your take on the expression crossing over?
It's funny, because I think death is a transition process, and I don't see death as something that is a finality. I think it's something that everybody goes through, just in the same way that everybody goes through birth and things like that. So I think for me, crossing over that is just a natural process. I think that's just what we do. I think that's what our consciousness is. That's the natural step for this to happen. And that would be my opinion on that.
Okay. And for ghosts, the human spirit that sticks behind?
What I've found in all my years of research, and my colleagues' years of research, is the fact that when they're hanging around and we get to communicate with these loved ones and whatever, is that the one thing that I've noticed is that they are very adamant about the fact that they are happy when they are moving. Are moving over. That this is a good thing for them, and I think that's the one thing that a lot of people miss out on. And so for me, the idea that they are that transition that happens, I think it's a really positive thing.
But not all of them grow.
Not all of them what, sorry?
Not all of them go. There's the ghost in your house.
I think, though, that at least from what I've understood and from the encounters that I've had over the years, what I've found is the fact that there's very much an awareness of why they're there. I find them very attentive as to the purpose that they have being there. I've not had the experience of somebody turning around and getting stuck. The encounters that I've had, they have been very alert and on purpose. So that's been my experience.
That's interesting. You take a psychic at all with you, or?
Yeah, we have a two actually, and one fellow he's brilliant, we have him with us, and occasionally the second one as well, but usually one guy we stick pretty close to. So. And
they don't ever talk about, or the psychic doesn't ever talk about this spirit wanting to go further or cross over.
We find that they are able to do that on their own. That people don't really have a say in it. We just don't feel that, that greater power, that energy, source energy, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't seem to need our help. So we haven't had that.
Yeah, we've actually did a show on crossing over a guy who died of natural causes in prison in 1942. Ended up in a house not too far from where I live now in British Columbia, lower mainland of British Columbia. A Ouija board, and some kids about 30 years ago brought him in, and he had been tearing up that house. He was angry. He was kicking the foot of the bed of the parents, and now the kids started to see him. And I have a psychic that goes in remotely, and I interview the spirit, and she describes him, and she's of course American and didn't understand what this guy was talking about, where he was from, but he was from Drummondville, Quebec, and stabbed somebody during Prohibition, but died of natural causes in prison, and how he got to the house, and we moved him over because he was.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it's just not been my experience.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. It's if you do end up getting those, or even any ghost, and speak to them, and I call them ghosts because it's easier to separate them from spirit, which I think is like my mother who's standing behind me right now. She's in spirit, but she's not a ghost. She's already done her thing. But if you get that opportunity to actually, through your psychic, have a conversation with them.
Oh yeah, and that's definitely happened. But that's typically not been the conversation we've had. It's been very much the other way. So yeah, it's just that's where we sit on it. That's
kind of cool. Yeah, I've never heard of that. So that's interesting. That so you're in your experience, you've never had to, never been. I guess your perception is that they cross when they want to because they can. And it's true. It's basically after a while that connection, it fades away, but it's always there. You just have to point it out to them. And then you go. Oh.
Well, I think people too. I mean, we oftentimes think that our connection to people who have passed away is gone, right? Like, and I think that's where that's where this gets messed up. At least for me, is the fact that I think the living is where the connection needs to be reestablished. I think people think that once that person's gone, then they're gone. And I read a poem once about somebody that it's basically it took place from the perspective of somebody who passed away, and they said, I'm not gone. I just went into the next room. And I think that's probably the best analogy. But I think where people really start to suffer, despite differing opinions on what happens after you die, because God knows, nobody really knows. But I think at the end of the day, that's what I would like to see more of, is people being empowered to know that they are able to connect with the people that they believe that they've lost, but they can't do it from a place of sadness. They got to get to a place of joy. It's interesting. In Northampton University, they were doing a study where they were looking at bereavement and people that have lost individuals and whatever, and when they had these encounters with the people that they've lost, or they've had these apparitions show up or whatever. And what was interesting was that they were always in a state of non-resistance every time. They were doing something benign, they were vacuuming, or they were doing the dishes, or they were in a space where they let their grief go, and they were just they'd calmed their minds down just enough that they were beginning to open themselves up to the peace of their surroundings. And all of a sudden, bam, this stuff started to happen, and they would see their grandmother or their father or whoever. And I think those studies need to come out, and they need to be looked at by more people.
Yeah,
I think people would. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way of putting it, because I know, as again, reflect as a policeman, going into a situation where somebody's energy, somebody's adrenaline is up and they're pumped and they're very, very emotional, to interact with that person is not the best way to walk into a situation. You don't want to interact with somebody who's spinning out of control, and you'd rather just kind of try to we would diffuse that as best we could, but it would be way better when you get there and the thing is already diffused, and then you can have a decent conversation. I wonder if it's the same thing on the other side, where they're just going to wait and go, oh, look, we can't go see Aunt Martha because she's bouncing off the walls right now, and we'll just freak her out. So how about we just wait until she relaxes and calms down, and then we'll go say, hey, everything's okay, and the will is under the fridge.
And the wills of it, yeah, like that. Well, I think too, it has to do with, we're talking about vibration or whatever. I think, when you get to those higher vibrations, and I think if you've got somebody that's hanging out, in the lower emotional vibrations, like depression or upset or grief or anything like that, I don't even think those people are in range of them anymore. It's like, then we're talking this, the issue of frequency, right? And it's like, if you've got somebody that's tapping into 9:30 a.m., trying to tap into like 96.5 FM, they're not going to get the station. So I don't even think at that point that you're really accessible to them. And it's when you let that go a little bit and you let that resistance go a little bit, then you kind of let your cork bob back to the surface, and all of a sudden you've got something that's a little more accessible. And I think we saw that with like I was mentioning at the beginning with the Philip table tipping experiment. It's such a prime example of that. So I think vibration is absolutely a key part of the conversation.
Now, just so my listener catches up to you, could you kind of explain the table tipping experiment?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was probably one of the most fascinating experiments that they've done, and it was done by the SPR in Toronto, and they decided that they wanted to get together and do an old-fashioned seance, but they didn't want to call in some spirit that was supposed to exist. What they were going to do was they were going to see if they could create a consciousness from nothing, and they wanted to know if consciousness could exist without the brain, basically. So what they decided to do was create a character, and they created a guy by the name of Philip. And Philip had his whole backstory, and he was a cheater, and he had this mistress, and there was a whole deal with the mistress, and the mistress ended up dead, and he was partly responsible, and there was a whole backstory that they created for this guy. The guy never existed. And they decided that they were going to start using all of the same seance techniques, including table tipping, to try to get something to respond. And eventually, like they went at this for about a year, and they were doing everything. They were, trying things like, just sitting very still and being very somber about the whole thing. This went on for a year, and there was nothing. And then finally they thought, you know what? We're missing something. What is the missing piece here? And they realized that the one thing that they hadn't done, which the other seances had gotten great results with, was they hadn't added joy. And they started adding joy. They started laughing and joking and enjoying each other. And within about 48 hours, stuff started happening. Bam. Immediately. And it got to the point where what they had essentially on the other end was a consciousness, an active consciousness, and it responded to the name Philip. It was interactive. It moved physical objects, moved chairs. It would respond to questions through knocking, all sorts of stuff. So they decided that they were going to replicate the experiment, and there was another group that tried it, and they came up with another character, and this character's name was Lilith, and she was a spy. So this character was built, and they tried it, and damned if it didn't work again. So they began to realize that there was like, no, this is absolutely, number one, there's an element here that we are manifesting something non-physical out of nothing that is responsive to questions. It acts under its own accord. And it seems to be that joy is a massive component to this. So it was a really interesting experiment. But I think it kind of goes back to this idea of like, can consciousness be fundamental rather than emergent? And I think the answer is yes.
See, that is really cool. That is
it's amazing.
Yeah, it's a cool experiment, and something that a group, as long as they're recording and making good notes, you can replicate that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was replicated, and it worked.
Yeah, it's something. Now I want to do it.
Yeah, and it wasn't that long ago. It was the 1970s. We're not talking the 1900s here.
Yeah. Where some of the when table tipping was still a parlor trick.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes. That's where it originally came from, was something did tip the table, and then it became a parlor trick because everybody else wanted to cash in on the I'm a psychic or a guru kind of thing that was going on. We'll be all good. Morgan Knudsen, she is a parapsychologist. She is an investigator. You can see her on Haunted Hospital or Haunted 911.
Paranormal 911 and both Haunted Hospital and Paranormal 911 are on Travel and Escape in Canada, and for the U.S. listeners, it's on, or I guess TNE, where they rebranded, so it's TNE Network, and then the Travel Channel in the U.S. First season of both shows have been out now, and season 2 of Haunted Hospitals will be airing shortly.
Oh, season 2 of Haunted Hospitals. How many episodes per season?
Oh gosh, how many are we at now?
25.
We gotta be closer to the 20 mark. It's been pretty cool. And Paranormal 911, we're looking for first responder stories too. So if anybody wants to come forward, that would be absolutely incredible. And they can get a hold of me.
And then get a hold of you. Go to your website and
they sure can. Yeah, and I will pass them over to these amazing producers because they will treat them with the utmost care.
And if we're ever up in Edmonton, we can go on Fireside Ghost Experience with you?
You sure can. Yeah, we're booking dates now, actually, so they are more than welcome to come out.
And wear a jacket this week if you do come out.
No kidding.
It's a little on the chilly side.
It's cold. It was like 4 degrees today.
4 degrees, and that scares the heck out of Americans because they forget that we're Celsius. So, but that's cold. Everybody, if you can see your breath and you're in Edmonton, it's cold, but it keeps the mosquitoes down. So that's a good thing. Yes. Morgan Knudsen, you are an amazing person with all the stuff that you do. Paranormal lecturer, presenter, author. You can find her writings in Haunted Magazine. And if you go online, you can also see her book, Teaching the Living from Heartbreak to Healing and in a Haunted Home. And it's actually out in ebook form as well as paperback. And again, fire off your website for me.
EntitySeeker.ca.
EntitySeeker.ca. Don't say seekers, say seeker. Thank you, Morgan. Thanks very much for dropping by. I've actually learned quite a bit and have way more questions, which is how this works. Yeah.
I love it.
Okay, you have a good night.
You too.
That's it. Let's roll. And hey. Let's be careful out there.
Far over the snow, what are those voices? They sing as they go. What are those voices? Look up for the mountain. Here come the mountain. Because somebody No!